All right, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on Stoicism and surviving 2020 like a Stoic. My name is Matt Huey, and I'm a member of the Salt Lake City Stoics, located here in Salt Lake City, Utah. And I have the distinct privilege of being your moderator for this evening's discussion. Today, we are honored and excited to be joined by renowned author and psychologist, Donald Robertson. Before we get started, however, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items so you know what to expect and how to participate in today's event. The general format of today's webinar will include a quick introduction to the Salt Lake City Stoics group by founder Joel Skeen, immediately followed by a 30-minute presentation from our special guest, Donald Robertson, and then approximately 20 minutes of Q&A. Throughout the course of the webinar, you'll have the opportunity to submit questions as they may arise. To do so, simply type your questions into the Q&A section located on the control panel. Our guest will address as many questions as he can during the allotted time, with those questions receiving the most upvotes given priority. Also, for those of you who may have to depart early, fear not, we will be recording this webinar and we'll be sharing that link after the event. Now, with that out of the way, let's get this webinar started. To give our new Zoom attendees an introduction to our growing group and to introduce tonight's special guest, it's my pleasure to present to you the founder of the Salt Lake City Stoics, Joel Skeen. Joel, over to you, my friend.
Thanks, Matt. Really grateful for you and to all of you guys for joining us here this evening, and especially grateful to Donald Robertson for taking his time out of his day to get to spend with us and get to add some value to our lives. And so I'm really grateful to all of you guys and to Donald here. My name is Joel. I started the Salt Lake Stoics, and I just put up a meetup group up. These guys that are around us are really the ones who started it because they showed up. And we, at that first meeting, decided that we were going to continue to meet where we were going to put a focus, yes, on understanding philosophy, understanding what the Stoics meant by what they said and the history and the context. But we noticed at that first meeting that what really drew a lot of us there was that this was a philosophy not just of words, but really of action and of actually implementing these practices and these virtues. And so it's both a group to help us learn more and understand better, but it's also a group where we get to support each other in that personal growth journey. So currently we are meeting every other week on Zoom on this Thursday night time slot. You will receive a link in an email if you registered for this event that will give you that link, so you feel free to join us. We love everybody from PhDs to newbies who have no idea what they're talking about. So we'd love to all have you join us. But let's go ahead and get to it. I'm so excited and so grateful that Donald decided to join us here today. He is the author of 6 books, including what I consider to be a classic, Stoicism and the Art of Happiness. It was actually the first book that we read as a group, as an introduction to the topic. He is an expert not only in this topic, but also in modern cognitive behavioral therapy, and especially the links that, and kind of the foundation that Stoicism has of modern CBT. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and turn it on over to Mr. Donald Robertson. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you very much, Joel, for the introduction, and thanks to Matt as well. It's a pleasure to be here. So what I'm going to do is share my screen with everybody. There we go. And I thought I'll start by saying a little bit about myself. I'm going to skim through some of these initial slides that I've got. So hopefully you can all see them okay. Let me know if you have any problems with the sound or the slides or anything. And what I really want to get into, I'll do a little introduction. I'll say a little bit about what Stoics believe. I know that we probably have a mixture of different levels among people today. So there might be people that are complete newcomers. So they'll need to be introduced to some of the ideas of Stoicism briefly. And then there are probably some of you who know a lot about Stoicism. So what I really want to get into are the psychological techniques of Stoicism and how those perhaps can help you in a challenging time, like the time of the pandemic that we're living through at the moment. So I'll say a little bit about myself. Obviously, I'm Scottish. I'm a psychotherapist. I live in Canada. I'm speaking to you from Nova Scotia at the moment. My background is in academic philosophy originally, actually. My first degree is in philosophy. And then I get into the relationship between philosophy and psychotherapy. I trained in many different styles of psychotherapy and practiced in different contexts over the years. And then I began getting involved in Stoicism around 1998, which is a frighteningly long time ago now. And these are some of my books on the subject. And the thing that I'm working on at the moment is a graphic novel about the life and philosophy of Marcus Aurelius. And that's my last book, How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, which is published in a bunch of different languages as well. And I'm one of the founding members of an organization that I should give a quick plug for, called Modern Stoicism, which was founded in 2012 by Christopher Gill, who's Professor Emeritus of Ancient Thought at the University of Exeter in England. And the Modern Stoicism organization is a non-profit. It's run by a multidisciplinary team of volunteers, including some well-known authors, Massimo Paolucci, John Sellers, for example. Bill Irvine in the past has been a member of the team. And it does all these things like the annual Stoicon conference and the Stoic Week event and stuff like that. So I just wanted to give a quick mention, a quick shout out to the Modern Stoicism organization for those of you who might not know about it. So I'll say a little bit about what Stoicism is. It's an ancient Greek philosophy, obviously. It thrived for about 500 years. The last famous Stoic was the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius. And the main thing I think I want to say about Stoicism is what it isn't. So the word Stoicism has come to mean something slightly different over time. And we usually make a distinction between the modern concept of a personality trait or a coping style and the ancient Greek philosophy, because the latter is capitalized. So Stoicism has come to mean an unemotional coping style. So a way of being that involves suppressing or concealing one's emotions. And obviously Stoicism capitalized refers to the ancient Greek philosophy that also flourished in the Roman Empire. And that distinction is particularly important, and it's close to my heart as a psychotherapist, because there's a body of scientific research in the field of psychology and in health research that strongly suggests that lowercase Stoicism is actually quite unhealthy. And particularly in the long term, it has a negative effect on emotional resilience. Whereas Stoicism capitalized is, as we'll see, the philosophical inspiration for modern cognitive therapy, which is a leading evidence-based form of psychotherapy. So lowercase Stoicism seems to be unhealthy psychologically or emotionally, whereas uppercase or capitalized Stoicism, we have good reason to believe is actually quite healthy psychologically. And just as another aside about that, and to link those two things together, Modern Stoicism, the organization, conducts research on the benefits of Stoic philosophy for modern living. And Tim LeBon, who's a member of our team and writes up our data and analyzes it, I'll give you a sneak preview. Tim is about to announce a research finding from the Stoic Mindfulness and Resilience training course that we just did that had 5,000 participants from all around the world in it. And Tim was testing the hypothesis that there is no significant correlation between lowercase Stoicism and Stoic philosophy. So you'll find out very soon what the stats actually say when he compared those two things. And I think you'll find that interesting. You should find that interesting, and it will have, hopefully, an effect on the perception of Stoicism among health researchers and psychotherapists. So I'll say a little bit about Stoic philosophy for those of you who are maybe more new to the subject. The main thing is, the whole point of Stoicism is that it's an ethic, fundamentally. It's a whole philosophical system, but the cornerstone of Stoicism is its ethical teachings. And those ethical teachings, as you'll see if you look at them closely, kind of have obvious psychological implications. I'll just mention that the reason I was drawn to Stoicism originally, way back in the day when I first started studying it, was because it seemed kind of obvious to me that our values have quite profound implications for our emotional well-being. And that was something that always kind of bothered me a bit. For example, somebody that invests a hell of a lot of importance, a lot of value in what other people think of them, say in their reputation or their standing in the eyes of other people, you'd think is going to be more vulnerable to developing problems like social anxiety. You know, there seems to be an obvious connection between the amount of value we invest in certain types of things and our emotional reaction to them. And there's an obstacle for modern psychotherapists saying that, which is that psychotherapists can't really indoctrinate clients into a particular set of values. We have to be kind of value neutral. So there's an area outside which we can't really go, as it were. Whereas the Stoics were able to do that. They were able to teach a particular set of values in a kind of more directive way. And it seems obvious to me that those values hold a lot of promise as a form of emotional resilience. And actually, I'll say one other little aside about that. CBT, clues in the name, cognitive behavioral therapy, is therapeutic, or as we say, remedial. It's a Johnny-come-lately psychologically, because generally speaking, with some exceptions, you have a diagnosis, you already have a problem when you go in to see a cognitive behavioral therapist for some remedial psychological work. And the holy grail of psychological research would be prevention is better than cure. It would be to do what we call emotional resilience building, which is the term that we tend to use for helping people to become, to prevent the development of serious psychological problems in the future. So prevention is much better than cure. Well, Stoicism is very interesting to psychologists because it seems to have this kind of potential as a form of long-term resilience building, as a preventative approach, which is something that traditional CBT struggles to offer. And actually, some of the research that modern Stoicism did in the past and has already published showed that Stoicism, the benefits were maintained at 3-month follow-up. So psychologists like to call that stickiness. So we can say Stoicism is sticky. There's some evidence already that Stoicism is sticky. So the goal of Stoicism, the ethic of Stoicism, is living in agreement with virtue, living in agreement with nature, by which the Stoics meant living in accord with our own essential nature as rational and social beings. So the Stoics say that's synonymous with what they mean by living in accord with virtue, arete, or moral wisdom. That's the other way that we can frame that. So Stoicism is a virtue ethic. And very simply, the main corollary of that is the idea that external things, which everyone else is running around after and placing a lot of value in, as far as the Stoics are concerned, are relatively unimportant. They're not life or death matters. They're not the be-all and end-all. And they don't compare to virtue in terms of their importance. And that's obviously significant because someone who genuinely believes that their own strength of character, their own moral wisdom is infinitely more important than whether other people like them or not, or achieving external success or wealth, you'd think is going to be more resilient emotionally in the face of setbacks or losing some of those external goods. So hopefully it's fairly kind of self-evident what the relationship would be there between the fundamental ethical teachings of Stoicism and the kind of emotional resilience that Stoics teach. The Stoics have this idea about good, bad, and indifferent passions or emotions, if you like. And I think that's important to emphasize because I'll come back to this later maybe, but I don't want to spend too much time on the theory except to say that the Stoics have a much more nuanced theory of emotion than most people typically assume. So even many academics in the past believed that the Stoics were just saying we should get rid of all emotion. And that's not what they're saying. They think we should cultivate healthy, rational emotions. They also think we should practice acceptance of the involuntary precursors of emotion, the propathei, as they call them. So the short version of that is that the Stoics have a much more sophisticated, much more nuanced theory of emotion than people typically assume. And that's one of the reasons why it's not the same as lowercase Stoicism, this idea of just having a stiff upper lip and kind of concealing or repressing emotions. Now, why Stoicism is particularly of interest historically, why it became of interest to psychotherapists, is that in the 1950s, psychotherapists were getting fed up with Freudianism. And one of them in particular, a guy called Albert Ellis in New York, who had been a psychoanalytic therapist, decided he was going to start again from scratch. And he looked around for some inspiration for developing a new approach to psychotherapy. And Ellis had read Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, although interestingly, he doesn't seem to have read Seneca. He'd read Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus earlier in life. He read Marcus when he was a teenager, in fact. And he thought, there's stuff in this Stoicism that seems to make a lot of sense to me. And in particular, there's a quote from Epictetus, which Marcus Aurelius actually, incidentally, also quotes in the Meditations, the same sentence. Epictetus says in passage 5 of the Enchiridion, it's not things that upset us, but our opinions or judgments about them. And that's probably the single most famous quote from the Stoic literature, for the simple reason that Ellis taught that quote to all of his students and all of his clients, and generations of subsequent cognitive behavioral therapists all had this so familiar to them that it became a kind of cliche in the CBT field. And the reason that they taught that quote is that it encapsulates what we now call the cognitive theory of emotion, which is the fundamental theoretical basis of all cognitive therapy. And so it's perfectly summed up in that quote, and the quote's easy to teach to clients. So it's an easy, convenient way. So Ellis literally taught that quote from Epictetus to most of his clients, perhaps all of them. So there's a quote from Ellis here. In 1962, he wrote, "This principle, which I've inducted from many psychotherapy sessions and scores of patients during the last several years, was originally discovered and stated by the ancient Stoic philosophers." And Aaron Beck, later in the first major treatment manual for clinical depression, Beck, the founder of what we call cognitive therapy, Ellis founded the main precursor of cognitive therapy called rational emotive behavior therapy. So Aaron Beck said the philosophical origins of cognitive therapy can be traced back to the Stoic philosophers. And so Stoicism is very much the philosophical basis of cognitive therapy, the leading evidence-based form of modern psychotherapy. And you could also say that Stoicism is kind of the granddaddy of all modern self-help literature. I'm going to mention just a couple of quick asides about that. When we first started talking about this, like I would say to people, in Hellenistic philosophy in general, there's a lot more emphasis on therapeutic techniques, meditation techniques, psychological techniques. And of all the different schools of ancient philosophy, the Stoics were the one that were known for placing the most emphasis on that aspect of the philosophy. So you get this in Epicureanism, in Platonic philosophy and Aristotelianism to some extent, but the Stoics were known in the ancient world for being the school that had the most to say and had the largest repertoire of psychological techniques, the most to say about the therapeutic dimension of philosophy. And some people initially said, well, you guys are all psychotherapists and you're kind of projecting psychotherapy onto the ancient Stoics. And I'll be honest, I thought that showed a woeful ignorance of the subject itself, because the medical metaphor of philosophy is absolutely prevalent in the ancient literature, particularly in the Stoic literature, from Socrates and the Pythagoreans all the way down through the Stoics. It's very common to refer to philosophy as a psychological therapy. In fact, Chrysippus, the third head of the Stoic school, wrote a famous book, lost to us now, called On Therapeutics, about psychological therapy. And even in the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, at the beginning of that book, Marcus thanks his main Stoic tutor, Junius Rusticus, for persuading him that he required therapeia, like therapy or Stoic therapy. So they even used the word therapy, and they referred to it as a therapy of the mind or of the psyche. So what I really wanted to get into are these Stoic techniques that we're going to discuss. So the main technique of Stoicism is described in the opening sentences of the Discourses of Epictetus, and also in the first sentence of the Enchiridion, or Handbook of Epictetus. And they didn't have a name for it, but today we tend to call it the dichotomy of control, or I call it the Stoic fork sometimes. And so the opening sentence of the Enchiridion says, some things are up to us and other things are not, which is an odd sentence because it seems like a platitude. It seems like a truism. Obviously, some things are up to us and other things are not. And so then you have to ask, why would that sentence be so profound? Why would it be placed at the beginning? Why would it be something that resonates with so many people? Because we have an inherent psychological tendency to blur this distinction. And most people seem to instinctively recognize that we all have a habit of doing this, of trying really hard to control things that aren't actually under our control, and also neglecting to take responsibility for things that are directly under our control. There's two sides to it, really. You can describe this as a distinction between what we do, our own voluntary actions, and the things that merely happen to us or our experiences. So some people misunderstand this, by the way, by thinking that Stoics are kind of distinguishing between degrees of control that we have over external things. That's not what Epictetus means. We know that because he explains it in the next sentence of the book. So he says, literally, I mean, things that are up to us are our own voluntary actions, and everything else is to be distinguished from that as being not completely or not directly under our voluntary control. And this technique isn't central to cognitive therapy, this construct or concept, but it is very common in modern self-help literature, particularly because it became fundamental to Alcoholics Anonymous and similar kinds of support groups. So the serenity prayer that's used in Alcoholics Anonymous says, God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference, which is basically the dichotomy of control, as we call it in Stoicism. So I would say the main technique of Stoicism, and sometimes by technique, I think people often imagine that techniques would be kind of concrete behavioral things. There are behavioral techniques in therapy. There are visualization techniques in therapy. There are contemplative practices. There are verbal techniques. There are cognitive techniques that we can use. And this is what I would call a cognitive technique. It's a psychological technique that consists in reminding ourselves to carefully distinguish between things that are under our direct control and everything else. And that technique seems to be very beneficial. I haven't got time to do it right now, but what I would normally do is go into a kind of deep dive explaining a really specific example of how that would apply in my specialism, which is the treatment of anxiety disorders. So I would say that to pick an example in the treatment of anxiety disorders, for instance, the blurring of that distinction is absolutely fundamental. So people that suffer from certain forms of anxiety clearly neglect things that are under their voluntary control and struggle too hard to control things that aren't under their direct control. And I would have specific things, actually specific aspects of anxiety in mind that maybe might come up during the questions or later. Now, the other main technique of Stoicism, the other absolutely foundational technique, apart from the dichotomy of control, is embodied in the quote that we just mentioned. It's not things that upset us, but our judgments about them. And for the Stoics in particular, it's our value judgments. So if you cast your mind back, I said there's this relationship between Stoic ethics and Stoic psychotherapy. It's mainly our value judgments that upset us. So for instance, obviously, if I lose my job and I think, oh my God, that's catastrophic, like judging it to be catastrophic is gonna be upsetting to me. And sometimes the Stoics will put it as simply as that. For example, there's an anecdote about Zeno, the founder of Stoicism, having some lentil soup smashed all over him in the Keramikos, in this public area, a crowded area in Athens, by Crates, his Cynic teacher. And Crates said to him, this memorable saying, he says, nothing terrible has happened to you, which really sums up one of the fundamental teachings of Stoicism. Nothing terrible has happened to you. You're imposing the value judgment on the lentil soup washing down your body. You're viewing it as terrible or catastrophic. But in fact, in nature, catastrophes don't exist. It's only in our own system of values, our own response to things, that these kind of value judgments, that something's awful or catastrophic, exists. So a big part of Stoicism consists in being aware that we're projecting our values onto external things. And we now know, I cut a long story short here, so forgive me if I'm being kind of blunt or concise about this. There's a large body of emerging research now that has led to a kind of sea change in modern psychotherapy. So we now know, and have for 15, 20 years or so, that this process that we call cognitive distancing, or behavioral psychologists call verbal diffusion, incidentally, this process called cognitive distancing is one of the most powerful cognitive processes in mental health and psychotherapy. And cognitive distancing consists in being able to separate our thoughts, beliefs, judgments from the external things to which they refer. So normally if you lose your job and you think it's awful, you just think the fact you lost your job is awful, in the same way that something is big or small or near or far away, or heavy or light, it's awful or catastrophic. It's as if you're describing a quality of the event. And we call that also fusion, this merging or blending of our value judgments with external things. And so realizing that this is something that comes from within us, that we're projecting it onto external events, and therefore separating our judgments from the things to which they refer, is known as cognitive distancing. So the founder of cognitive therapy, Aaron Beck, used to explain that to clients by saying, imagine that you had colored glasses on, like rose-tinted glasses, and you'd been wearing them for such a long time, you just started to think that the world actually was rose-tinted, that things just were that color, until someone else comes along who's wearing blue glasses and they tell you that they see it differently. And so you take your glasses off and you look at them instead of looking at the world through them, and you realize that the rose tintedness exists in the lenses rather than being a quality that resides in the external world per se, and that there may be other lenses through which you could look at events. And so realizing that that quality, the rose tintedness or the yellowness, exists in the lens, that the awfulness exists in the lens rather than in the external event, is cognitive distancing. So it's a subtle concept. Some people get it immediately, other people kind of struggle to wrap their head around the idea. Cognitive therapists have many techniques and strategies to help people familiarize themselves with the concept, but it's so important because it's a single maneuver. So in a sense, it's a simple thing to do, and it has very generic, very widespread benefits. And we know that it's a very powerful technique. So I would say those are the two most powerful, most fundamental psychological techniques in Stoicism: the dichotomy of control, cognitive distancing. These are both modern terms for ancient techniques. And many of the other Stoic techniques are derived from them or relate to them in some way or another. The first book I wrote on Stoicism is called The Philosophy of Cognitive Behavioral Therapy. It just went into its second edition, actually. And in that book, I tried to review all of the psychological techniques that I could find in Stoicism. I didn't number them, though. So when I revised, I went back and I thought, I'll count how many there were. And there were about 18 distinct psychological strategies that I could identify in the Stoic literature. So the Stoics have this whole toolbox, or as we say, armamentarium of different techniques, like at least 18 of them. And those are just two of the more fundamental ones. So let me just check how we're doing. Okay, we've just got like a few minutes left. So I'll quickly introduce you to some of the other psychological techniques. So one of the other techniques that the Stoics use that you may have noticed is something that in Stoic week we call the morning meditation. So Marcus, in perhaps one of the most famous passages in the Meditations, Meditations 2.1, says every morning when you awaken, tell yourself that you're going to meet meddlesome, treacherous, deceitful, arrogant people. And so Stoics will premeditate adversity. They'll prepare themselves in advance for the kind of setbacks that they might encounter in general or throughout the day ahead, including troublesome or difficult people that they might meet. And so Stoics will practice viewing these things, again, separating through the lens of the dichotomy of control and cognitive distancing. So some people call this negative visualization. I don't like that term because it implies that the thing that you're viewing is negative, whereas the essence of the Stoic technique is to learn to view these external events as intrinsically neutral or indifferent, and realizing that the negativity is something that we project into external events, It's a value that we impose on them, and there's a kind of subjectivity or arbitrariness about it, if you like, that other people might view these things differently, or invest less importance, relatively speaking, in them. So the Stoics want us to practice the things that could happen to us. And Marcus is practicing the people, rehearsing the kind of difficult people that he might meet in the day ahead, and rehearsing apatheia, or Stoic indifference, towards them, using these principles that we've already mentioned. Another thing that the Stoics would rehearse, many people have asked me, how would Stoics deal with finding themselves in the middle of a pandemic? And a kind of half serious answer to that, or actually a serious answer to it, is that Stoics would have already prepared long in advance for the current pandemic. And they would use the current pandemic to psychologically prepare for other setbacks or public health crises that are quite possibly going to happen in the future, and may even be much more serious than even the one that we're currently facing. I'll skip past that because we've already said a little bit about the premeditation of adversity. That slide goes into it in a little bit more detail, though. Another important technique that the Stoics do is think about the consequences of their actions. One of the Stoics' favorite slogans is that fear or anger do us more harm than the things that we're upset about. So our anger does us more harm than the person that we're upset with, or the thing that we're upset about. And this is one of their favorite paradoxes. So the Stoics like to think about the consequences of following reason or following passion. They may do that at the beginning of the day. Galen, Marcus Aurelius' physician, implies that the Stoics think about their day ahead and contrast following their passions, fusing their value judgments with external events, versus exercising cognitive distance and viewing things in a more detached, rational way. And thinking about the longer term consequences of doing that is one way of building our motivation to engage in psychological change. So Marcus has a whole repertoire of questions that he asks himself about his actions that are kind of related to this in different ways. One of them that I wrote an article about recently, the last article I wrote actually, was about the question, is this necessary? So Marcus, whenever he's engaged in some habitual behavior or something of dubious value, says that he'll practice pausing and asking himself, is this necessary? And by which he tells us that he means, does it actually contribute to my long-term happiness and well-being? Or in Stoic jargon, does it contribute to eudaimonia? Like, does being on Facebook right now actually contribute to my eudaimonia, like my fulfillment? Like, is it actually fundamentally doing anything for me? That is a very powerful question. It's one of the most, again, it links therapy and ethics, and it's kind of similar to questions that we use in a type of modern psychotherapy called values clarification, which is part of the leading evidence-based treatment for clinical depression, incidentally. So that's a technique that you guys can practice using. And I mentioned the morning meditation. There's also an evening meditation that the Stoics describe, which they derive from a famous poem called The Golden Verses of Pythagoras. And Epictetus quotes this, Seneca quotes it in On Anger, and Marcus's physician Galen also quotes it when he's talking about Chrysippus' therapeutics. So the Golden Verses of Pythagoras famously says that you shouldn't allow your eyes to close each evening until thrice you've mentally rehearsed the main events of the preceding day and ask yourself 3 questions, which I would kind of paraphrase as, what have you done badly? What did you do well? And what could you do differently next time? And those questions should be framed in terms of our fundamental goal of life. So what did you do that was consistent with your core values? So where can you praise yourself, encourage yourself to do more of that? What did you do that was in conflict or led you away from your fundamental goal or core values, or the virtues, if you want to put it that way? And what did you just omit? What did you forget about or neglect to do that you could remember to do tomorrow that might be consistent with your goal in life, your core values, that might contribute to eudaimonia. So these are questions that really help us to recalibrate our whole sense of direction and purpose in life. You know, they're not just about managing anxiety, they're much more fundamental than that. They're about their quality of life, our whole purpose and meaning in life. And so the Stoics make a little routine. Seneca in particular talks in quite a quaint way about how he does this each evening. And he tries to do it, also he says he tries to do it in a kind of compassionate manner. He's not kind of hectoring to himself or overly critical of himself, but as if he's taking advice from a benevolent friend. So that may be sufficient for the time being. I'm just watching the time. I think I'll conclude there and open it up to questions, and maybe some of the questions will be about practical techniques, I would assume, as well, and we can maybe throw in a couple of the other ones that we didn't have time to cover in the presentation there. But that's a fair sample of some of the more basic Stoic psychological techniques.
Donald, thank you so much for that. It's really interesting to hear sort of how CBT has its roots founded in Stoicism. And I thought what you said about nature not having any value judgments, that in nature, value judgments do not exist, to be particularly salient. So thank you again for that presentation. So again, I want to remind our audience that if you have questions for Donald, go ahead and put them into the Q&A part of Zoom. So if you go to your Zoom controls, there should be a button on there that says Q&A, and go ahead and type your question in there. And if you like other people's questions, be sure to upvote those questions because we'll give them priority. So we have slightly less than 20 minutes for Q&A, and I know Joel has been anxiously awaiting to ask Donald the question. So go ahead, Joel.
I would love to just sit and chat with you about this for a very, very long time. But I was thinking about what's kind of most pertinent, or what would be the most valuable to everybody that's on the line here. And you just finished, for those of you that don't know, Donald just finished a new book that I haven't got to yet, but I know, Matt, you read it and said loved it, called How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, specifically about Marcus Aurelius. And Marcus, we're actually finishing up meditations right now as a group. And we are also at this time, I feel like, as a people, no matter where you live, just going through probably more change than we are used to. And it doesn't seem like the world is going to slow down in its acceleration of change anytime soon. And I feel like Marcus talks a good deal about change. And I was just curious your perspective on living in a world that changes a lot faster. And that's more maybe kind of what does that look like for a modern Stoic dealing with ever changing environments and self, maybe?
I think that's a good question. There's a lot of references to change in the meditations. So the two philosophers that Marcus talks about most often, we can say his two favorite philosophers are Epictetus and Heraclitus. Those are the two guys that he quotes most often. And I'll tell you, there's a really neat passage in the Meditations where Marcus tries to condense his philosophy into a short, pithy, memorable saying. So there's a famous passage where he says, life is opinion. The universe is change, life is opinion. And we can see that those two, it's only 6 words in Greek. Like, life is opinion is his attempt to condense the teachings of Epictetus into just a few words. It's not things that upset us, but our opinions about them. So it's kind of an oversimplification, but we know that that's what he's referring to. Life is opinion, Epictetus. It's not things that upset us, but our opinions about them. So what about the other half? The universe is change. That's his attempt to sum up the philosophy of Heraclitus, who said you can't step into the same river twice because new waters are constantly flowing through it. So he was known for this teaching called Pantare, everything flows, like the Buddhist teaching of impermanence. There are many references to that throughout the meditations. So the Stoics would basically ask us to fundamentally embrace this whole philosophy of impermanence, to see stability and permanence is kind of an illusion in a way, and to mentally rehearse loss. Marcus thinks that we should make a daily practice out of imagining the absence of things that we possess. And that could be loved ones. It could be the loss of our possessions, the loss of our health. And he explicitly says, in order to practice gratitude for them. So not in order to kind of maximize sensory pleasure or something, as some people have suggested, but Marcus says this is a way of learning to cultivate gratitude. Like, so imagine that you didn't even have a roof over your head. You know, many people don't. Imagine your business just went bankrupt tomorrow. You know, imagine your wife left you, or something, like the people that you loved like passed away or something like that. You know, imagine like the absence of these things so that you can more fully appreciate the gift that you have in having them with you now, so that you can be more grateful for the things that you have in life. So the Stoics want us to meditate on impermanence at this kind of fundamental metaphysical level, to view everything as in flux, also as an actual psychological practice to keep reminding ourselves that any of these things could be taken away. Marcus says, tell yourself that anything you have is merely on loan to you. That's how you should phrase it. Like, your marriage is on loan, your business is on loan, your health is temporarily on loan to you. Again, as a kind of gimmick, a trick to remind yourself to be more grateful for the things that you have in life. And the other thing that would help us to remember that is the view from above. So this technique that that modern scholars call the view from above, that involves picturing your current situation in terms of the whole of space and time, that inherently highlights the impermanence of things and makes us more appreciative of the temporary nature of the things that we're experiencing now, because it requires thinking about the place of the present moment in terms of the whole of our life story and the whole history of the universe. So we will see the present moment, as Marcus puts it, as merely the mere turn of a screw. Like, so viewing the present is very fleeting and transient, and thinking about how different the rest of the time is and how short our own life is as well. So those are some of the kind of psychological techniques that Marcus would use to help maintain that mind state.
Okay, so we got a lot of questions coming in. This first one is from Cody Aliko. Would it be possible, he says, to get a copy of the presentation to review later on?
Yes, that was easy.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Donald. Okay, next question comes from Jeremy Cox. I noticed that often you speak of the Stoics as a collective that likely agree on most main topics. Are the camps within Stoicism, where'd we go? Are they camps within Stoicism, or are some differences in thought between the chief founders?
Yes.
And Don, if I can ask you just to stop your screen share so we can see that big, beautiful face of yours.
Oh, let me stop that. Okay. Okay, I'm back. Right. Well, okay. There's several ways I could answer that, but to keep it very brief, I'll just mention two things that we're told in the histories. One is we're told that Chrysippus, the third head of the Stoic school, disagreed with Zeno and Cleanthes, the first and second heads of the schools, on many different matters. So people say Chrysippus almost reinvented Stoicism. He approached it in a very different way from his predecessors, and he disagreed with them about a bunch of things. We normally divide the history of Stoicism into three stages. There's some academic debate about how much difference there is between the early Stoa, the middle Stoa, and the late or Imperial Roman Stoa. So that's one way of understanding the difference. There's an evolution between them, but there's some uncertainty about that. But another thing that not a lot of people know, that there's one late author in the Roman Imperial period tells us that the Stoic school split into three factions. And those three factions were named after the three last scholarchs, the three last heads of the Athenian Stoic school. So that implies that the last three guys to be in charge of the actual Stoa in Athens disagreed with one another, and their followers went off in different directions. And you can have a fun game trying to figure out which of those factions Seneca, Marcus Aurelius, and Epictetus would slot into. I'm going to wager that Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus would, I think, be in the same faction, and that Seneca, I feel, would have been in a slightly different brand, a different branch of Stoicism from them. And as an aside, I'll just mention one other little thing there. We've seen that Marcus really loves Heraclitus and Epictetus. Epictetus really loves Diogenes the Cynic. Seneca doesn't like the Cynics that much, and he tells us that apart from the Stoics, his favorite philosopher is Plato. So Seneca, I would say, represents a branch of Stoicism that leaned more towards Platonism, and Epictetus represents, in my view, a branch of Stoicism that leans more towards Diogenes and the Cynics.
Great. Okay. The questions are still rolling in. This is great, guys. This comes from Matt Misbach. Are there any recent examples of people either in popular culture, world leaders, etc., that you think exemplify Stoicism?
No.
Okay, interesting.
But, you know, I'll give you a different answer to that question. People have asked me that question many times, and I wasn't even sure why I struggled to answer it. And I think it's because I find it hard to judge someone's character because I've seen them on TV or I've read a biography of them or something like that. And if you were to ask me to point to somebody who I consider to be an exemplary role model in Stoic terms, it would be people that you would never have heard of. So my gut feeling instinctively, and I'll tell you the other paradoxical part of my answer to that question, is that instinctively the people that I think of when I'm asked that are recovering alcoholics or drug addicts that I've known over the years. People who have hit rock bottom in their lives and have then started to kind of recover and rebuild their life from scratch and went on to help other people. So humble, anonymous people that you would never have heard of are the ones that I would be more likely to think of as exemplary Stoic role models. And that, you know, like the ancient Stoics were also a bit like that, you know, Diogenes, the Cynic, Zeno, lost all his possessions. Epictetus started off as a kind of anonymous slave. So I would be more likely to think of people like that rather than world leaders or athletes and things.
I think that's encouraging. And Marcus kind of alludes to that, right? And that, you know, remember that after a period of years, your name is going to be sort of reduced to dust and that people will sort of forget you anyways.
I can't help but tell you another little piece of trivia about that. In book 1 of the Meditations, Marcus tells us all his role models. And the main one is Antoninus Pius, who wasn't a Stoic as far as we know. But one of the first role models he mentions is a guy who was his childhood tutor, who was probably a slave or a freedman. And Marcus doesn't even seem to remember the guy's name. But he had more of a profound effect on this humble slave in his mother's household, had more of an impact on him decades later than the most highly acclaimed academics in the Roman Empire, like Herodes Atticus or Marcus Cornelius Fronto. His other tutors were highly acclaimed, world-famous teachers. He doesn't mention them, but he says, no, this guy that taught me when I was a kid, I can't remember his name, but he's the one that I really look up to.
That's great.
Yeah.
So this next question comes from Tyson McCauley. He says, is Stoicism compatible with social movements such as union organizing? How can I apply these concepts so that I don't become burned out?
That's 2 questions, eh? So I can't see any reason why it wouldn't be compatible with social movements. I mean, gosh, like I feel like that's a complicated question, but I'll try and give the briefest answer I can. The risk in doing that is that I might not be giving the sort of answer that he's looking for. But some people, the premise behind a question like that might be that some people think Stoicism is a philosophy of political passivity. Maybe that's what drives the question, I'm not sure. And that's completely false. So the Stoics believed that we should be politically engaged, we should engage in public life. The Epicureans were more likely to withdraw from politics and public life. Chrysippus said we should engage in public life if nothing prevents us. And they thought that we should put ourselves out there and try and improve society. The famous Stoics were great statesmen, and many of them were anyway, and military commanders and so on. So they were very active people. They were very concerned with what we, you know, social virtue, or you might say social justice. One of the cardinal virtues is justice, dikaiosune. And so the Stoics would actually say you cannot be a virtuous person unless you exercise justice, which is a social virtue. So you'd have to be, you know, treating other people with kindness and fairness. Those are the 2 components of dikaiosune in order to exhibit arity or virtue. And then how, like, actually he's kind of hit the nail on the head in that the essence of Stoicism is this idea that the goal is to engage with the world, so to have values that drive action and that we're committed uh, to justice and to benefiting mankind, but to do so in such a way that we don't become upset about it. So the Stoics want to achieve this paradox, this balance of caring about the world, but not in such a way that we become upset about the world. They kind of want to have their cake and eat it. But that's, in a way, the fundamental question that the Stoics want to try and answer. Their whole philosophy is geared towards answering this question of how can you avoid either freaking out about the injustice in the world or just turning your back on it completely. How can you both engage with it and not be freaked out by it? And the whole philosophy really is an attempt to answer that question.
And to add on to that, Donald, like how should we think about like Marcus, for example, or some of these Stoics in the context with which they lived? I think there's a tension about sort of the time that they lived and some of the things that went on. I mean, like some of the wars during that time were really brutal. They had some brutal tactics. They had slavery during that time. Can you give us a sense for how to reconcile that tension sort of within us?
In 20 seconds or less.
Yeah.
So like I could talk all week about that question, right? So the problem is if I answer that, I'm going to say things that people think are controversial, but I'm steeped in this subject, so I'd happily debate the histories and the archaeological evidence and so on all day. But sometimes people say the Stoics accepted the institution of slavery and didn't question it. I would dispute that. I think there's evidence that the Stoics actually questioned the institute of slavery, but it would have been impossible, and Marcus would have realized it would be impossible to abolish slavery overnight in the middle of the Roman Empire. Although many people naively, in my view, think that the Roman emperor had kind of absolute power, you have to bear in mind that Roman emperors were assassinated all of the time. And also there were often civil wars instigated against them. Marcus faced a civil war, partly because his political stance was, there were a faction that opposed it. I would say that they thought that he was too much of a military dove, and there was a faction that just wanted to go and kill all the northern barbarians, right? So the Romans had this kind of scorched earth policy sometimes, and I think they were getting fed up with Marcus's diplomacy. So there are these tensions in Roman society. If Marcus has said, let's abolish slavery, let's abandon these wars, and he would have, the civil war would have just overthrown him overnight. He wouldn't have been able to hang on to power. So in the Meditations, I think one of the most important sentences in this regard is Marcus saying you cannot achieve the ideal republic overnight. You have to be satisfied if you're making one small step at a time, as long as you're moving in the right direction. So that's how he phrases it in the Meditations. And I think that sentence alone helps to explain how he was able to reconcile his Stoic, ethical, cosmopolitan values with the obvious injustices of the Roman Empire. And without getting too bogged down in the weeds, the wars that he fought were mainly in response to invasions. So he wasn't pursuing an aggressive military strategy by any means. We can see that the legislation that he passed, much of it concerns the rights of slaves and improving their opportunity for freedom or manumission.
Gotcha. Okay, we got time for maybe one more, maybe two quick questions if we can. So we have.
Let's do those two questions.
Okay, great. So we have one attendee writing in saying, "My experience is to be terrified of my mistakes or perceived mistakes. Mm-hmm. I've tried to apply CBT principles to overcome mistake anxiety, but I've been unsuccessful. Any comments or recommendations?"
Yeah, this is my specialism as a therapist. So again, I would happily lecture for a week on this. The short answer to this, the Stoics explicitly address this question. Marcus talks about it. There's also a very famous quote from Epicurus about this, incidentally. Epicurus says that the paradox is that, for example, in a debate, the person who's proven wrong is the person who benefits the most. So we should be welcome making mistakes or being or having our opinions being disproven by others, because that's what benefits us. If you're always right, you never grow, basically. And Marcus talks about this, like he wants other people to show him his mistakes. You know, he has to have the mindset of welcoming it. In therapeutic terms, I'd have to be very blunt about this. So normally I'd talk about this in much more detail. But essentially, what you're describing is related to treatment for social anxiety. And the way that we would normally treat it, the most robust technique, in my view, would be exposure therapy that consists in making deliberate mistakes. So as a public speaker, I would often mispronounce a word on purpose, or I'd deliberately pretend that what was I saying? I lost my place, like that, right? So I deliberately pretend that I'd forgotten what I was saying, and then I'd ask the audience just to remind me what I was talking about. Because these things that people fear are actually inherently trivial, right? Nobody really cares about it in the grand scheme of things. And the most powerful way of overcoming that is to force yourself to do it again and again voluntarily. And there are a bunch of nuanced reasons why that's beneficial, which I don't have time to elaborate on at the moment. But basically, the key has to be, in my view, it's very difficult to overcome fear of making mistakes unless you expose yourself repeatedly to making mistakes. That's my experience in dealing with that problem anyway.
Gotcha. Thanks for that, Donald. So last question here. I think it's something that a lot of people think about. What is your take on positive psychology as it relates to Stoic principles?
Tim LeBons, who's a member of our modern Stoicism team, wrote a book on positive psychology. And so he's the guy that's more involved with positive psychology per se. So the positive psychology is a burgeoning movement within the field of psychology, which does research on well-being and happiness and so on. I mean, I think a lot of the research in the field of positive psychology is very complementary to Stoicism. I mean, again, that's like a PhD thesis, right? It would take me like days to elaborate on that. But for example, Seligman's research, which is foundational to the positive psychology movement, places a lot of emphasis on identifying personal strengths and values and living in accord with them as a way of cultivating authentic happiness, as he calls it. To me, that's very obviously an echo of what the Stoics say about living in accord with our virtues in order to achieve eudaimonia. And I mean, again, I wish I was to talk in more detail about this, but there are many striking parallels between contemporary research and positive psychology and things that and those parallels are massively underappreciated. So positive psychologists haven't really said much about Stoicism so far, and they could say also even CBT practitioners haven't really said much about Stoicism other than Ellis quoting the Stoics. Like someone could easily write a book about positive psychology and Stoicism and really go into great detail about the parallels between the two traditions.
Great.
I think you just gave Martin his PhD or his master's thesis right there.
Yes. I'd love that. I think definitely like people should be doing their master's dissertations on that subject.
I think so.
And they will.
Oh, man, I wish we had more time. Unfortunately, we're out of time. We could just keep going on this, I think. And it's so great to talk to someone like Donald, who's so well-versed in this. So on behalf of myself, of the Salt Lake City Stoics, and those from attending from around the world, I'd like to thank our guest, Donald Robertson, for being so gracious to join us this evening and for giving us a better perspective on how to live like a Stoic, particularly in the modern context. I'd also like to thank all those who attended tonight's session and echo Joel's earlier invitation to have you join us if, like us, you're interested in sharing your practice and passion for Stoicism with others. So thank you, everyone. Stay safe and have a good night.
Thanks, Donald.
Cheers. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Donald.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.